I just turned 70. Seems amazing. Seems amazing. But I have a lot of life. So like I started mountaineering at 13, and then I was taking music lessons, and I went to a PhD in physics and traveled the world and had a couple of families and built a couple of houses, and I was on the East Coast, and I wasn't doing psychology well. I mean, if you know extreme sports, it involves psychology. It's your own head and other people's heads, and it's very valuable. Actually, I'm going to write a book now on why people do extreme sports. But so a lot of stuff has come together over time, and then let's see. Traveling around the world, I was climbing the mountains, and I kind of decided I should stop and smell the roses. So I lived with people in the Caribbean, Southern Caribbean, and lived with people in the jungle in Panama. Very eye-opening experience, I must say. And uh, made good friends in Mongolia, another quite different culture from mine. And then, I've had a certain amount of contact with indigenous people, but they're pretty kind of segregationists, very different, and I've never been part of their culture. Just interested. So I ended up getting involved with psychedelics because it was so interesting, ceremonial, medicinal, and now that's become popular, sort of, in psychology, but not really deeply. It's kind of like a fad. And then I got involved with hypnotherapy, which is cool, and did things like past life regression, which is also cool. And then I got a clinical counseling degree, you could say. And that's what I've been doing. But I've also started or returned to theoretical physics, which is, ooh, that's another story. That's a kind of a mean one. But, I had a lot of interest in it, so and I made a lot of progress. So I'm going to fight my way along in that one. So I'm writing books and dealing with clients, and yeah, a lot of things. Kids, family. So I moved to Canada, became a Canadian, just in time, I should add. Um, yeah, God, I can't understand. I don't know. When I was a little kid, I got very upset about the Vietnam War. Why should I? I was only 11. But I was very upset on it. It made no sense to me, killing and armies and all this stuff. And I used to go house to house collecting signatures, and people would be shocked that an 11-year-old was collecting signatures against the Vietnam War. And I just got more and more pissed off from, 1968 on. This endless stream of half-assed politicians. And now we've got a full-assed politician. I don't know where it goes from here. But yeah, so Canada's looking better and better from my point of view. So that's the brief one.
So let me ask you my first question then. You mentioned that you've traveled to all these places and you've met different types of people, and then you went back and you shared some of your own upbringing at 11. You weren't happy with the Vietnam War and other things like that. From from a child's perspective, maybe your own or those that you've worked with as clients and their families,
Yeah.
how do you see society today impacting the youth?
Well, I've been very active. I mean, you could sort of hear it in my story. I'm an I'm against institutions for the most part. I think they tend to be rather inhumane, and I'm against what do you call it? Compulsory education. I mean, sure, it's a good idea that everyone be educated, but what compulsory education generally amounts to is socialization. That's quite clear, actually. That was always the plan. In the very beginning. of government education. It was all about making workers better, making workers skilled, getting workers more productive. And then it kind of became psychologically making people compliant, making people um, normal, whatever that is. And so now I'm kind of very much against that kind of compulsory education. So when you say what's kids, what's a kid's world today? A kid's world is always going to be around school. It's where they make their friends. It's where they have a kind of not very complete relationship with their parents. And, um, teachers are sort of like surrogate parents, but it's a very kind of, it's not a well-defined relationship. They're not really parents. And for myself, I wanted more parents since my parents were kind of out of it. And the teachers never really lived up to my expectations. So I never felt at home in school. I didn't feel supported at home. I wasn't traumatized like some of the clients I get. There are a lot of people whose parents really should never have kids. But um, my parents were okay. They were inspiring. They weren't particularly supportive, but they helped me. My father made money by being a photographer, so that helped me, go travel the world when I was a teenager, and I didn't have to work until later. And um, yeah, meeting these other cultures was great for me. It's not something everybody has, that's for sure. I remember living in a fishing village in the Caribbean when I was 15, and I would, share. This is a black village, this is, Southern Caribbean, and I share a bed with a kid my age, and we would both like hang off either side of this crappy old bed spring, and uh, it was miserable, mosquitoes and all that stuff, but it was real, and it was a real family of a different culture. So I don't think kids get that. They really don't get that. So that's too bad. And school doesn't give it to them either. So your question, what is it? I don't know. I just have to encourage kids to respect themselves a lot more than the respect they're given, and be a lot more, or ask or demand more independence that they're given. And, I see, and I've seen this for several decades, kids get involved with computers as computer games, and it becomes their social life. It's been happening for 20 years or 30 years. And adults don't understand this. The kids are online 10 hours a day. And I think that's more of a social life than I had. You know, this is my son, and I think other kids. My son's 15, but from 11, I don't know when this starts. They're really, they have a society, they have a group, and I think there's going to be more of that. I don't know if it's going to get better or worse with AI and phony personalities floating around, but I think kids will gravitate toward each other as more authentic. And my son, he swears and curses like a sailor at his friends, and everybody kills everyone else. I don't think you do that with an AI friend. They're pretty nasty to each other, and that's their bonding. It's like trauma bonding. So I think more kids are going to be doing that. So we'll see what the software offers. It's going to be very interesting. Um, I mean, I'd like to tell kids, look higher, find your passion and don't take no for an answer. But it's very hard to do that. I mean, one thing I will say for kids always is find good teachers. And they're not even teachers. Find good mentors. Find people who are doing stuff that you want to do and follow them. I have this book that I wrote, first book I wrote called The Learning Project, where I interviewed kids and adults of all ages and all interests. And I asked them, how did they learn and what did they get out of it? And there were great stories, wonderful. Kids really, I mean, I picked my kids to be the unusual ones who, like one kid, he wanted to make movies and he wasn't learning it in high school. So he dropped out in 10th grade. And now he's making movies. He's been making movies for 20 years. And it's possible. The opportunities that are given to kids are not the only opportunities that are there. In fact, they're kind of a watered down version of what you can make for yourself. So that's what I'd encourage kids to do. And it may fall on deaf ears, but still, find teachers and don't get limited to the kind of homogenous, tepid. I mean, look at the teachers you get in schools. They're not creators, they're not thought leaders, they're teachers. They read the book, they give you the worksheets, and then they go home. You don't want to be around those people all the time. You want to be around inspired people. So you might have a hard time finding them because they don't seem, you got to turn over some rocks to find them. But, do it. If you like puppets, if you like games, if you like blowing things up, if you like building stuff, if you like fashion, go to the people who do it the most, not, the kind of social pablum that might be available in magazines or something. So I really encourage that for kids. Does that answer your sort of question? I don't know what
It
you were getting
does,
at, but
and
that's what I
no,
think.
it does, and it allows me to remember my childhood and going through school, and there was a period of time that I really enjoyed school, and then there's a time where I didn't enjoy school, and then there's a time that I really, really enjoyed it, and then there's a time that I was like, okay, I've had enough. But throughout that entire journey, let's say from elementary school to high school to post-secondary, what I learned, to your point, is that there's a few people, teachers that I remembered. And the reason why I remembered is because they stood out. They had the passion, they had the dedication, they had the guidance. They were able to lead us to want to become better. And sometimes when I look at some of the teachers today and some of the students today, I see that there's this competition between the classroom, the device, AI, as you mentioned, and everything that's going on in the household. And maybe the reason why so many people are struggling is because there's different things pulling them in different directions, which causes pressure to these children. What do you see impacting them when it comes to the device, AI, and the family dynamic to these young minds?
Well, I think all those things are unfortunately pulling them down. They're, AI by definition is average. It's a wonderful broad average, but it doesn't have any new ideas. It collects averages and presents all the ideas it can find, but it's not going to really inspire you. It's not going to be creative. So you have to understand that being creative involves making mistakes, failing, um, having crazy ideas, doing things that don't work, all the things that you're not encouraged to do. So if you want to be an inventor or a creator or a thought leader, um, you got to get used to failing effectively. You have a new idea and it's never going to be perfect because new things are new and you have to work through it. Okay, it's a mistake, Okay, people criticize you. You just have to keep, I guess, the you know how do you learn that? You have to have some inspiration to do something. So I remember when I was young, the thing that I was inspired to do was build plastic models of cars and planes and boats and then blow them up with firecrackers. I was I thought that was great. I'd burn them, but put lighter fluid on them. It was very exciting. It was like miniature disaster, Godzilla movie. And I liked that. It was something I could do. Other people didn't appreciate it. Well, I did it with myself or my friends. And another thing I did was, this was before the age of internet, and the only television I had were these like old, awful soap opera things that reruns that just I couldn't stand after a while. So I would go outside and I would like build paths through the woods because I was in an urban, rural area, and I would build forts. And they weren't very fancy; they were just kind of earth dugouts. And I was forced to do something. I also tried to do stuff in school, but nobody was really supporting me. They wanted me to read Johnny Tremaine or some, eighth grade book, and I'd get Goethe because I thought I wanted to go further, and they all laugh at me. And, and so I was never happy with that at the time, but I think if you have any aspirations, you're going to get pulled back toward the average to the extent that you hang out with, average people. And that's what most schools are. I mean, maybe you're lucky you go to a private school, but I have since become invested in what's called democratic education, which is basically growth oriented personal development education, where kids are just supported to do what they love. And they don't have a curriculum and they don't have grades and tests and stuff. But there aren't many schools like that. You get things like Montessori and Rudolf Steiner, but and they were sort of the early version. They're still very structured, and those aren't all that expensive. Um, they're not like prep schools, so those are an option. And I remember I was so unhappy with high school that I wanted to get somewhere else, but I didn't know what else. So I remember my parents weren't very involved, so they would like drive me around to these private schools. I went to a school called Fieldston. I went to a school called Rye Country Day. I didn't attend them. I went to visit them. And they were expensive, preppy, waspy schools. And I couldn't relate to that. It, they weren't my people, and I wasn't all that clear they were going to be any better. So I eventually gave up. I went back to high school and suffered my way through it. One thing I did, I think anybody can do this, is I said, I'm going to get out of here as soon as I can. So I was able to take an extra course every year so that I met graduation requirements by the time I finished 11th grade. And then I could get the hell out of there. Most people's senior year doesn't amount to much anyway. So, you know, and then I went to college and things, they started getting better. Yes, definitely. I went to a, very supportive. Now these colleges are so expensive, but even going to a state college or a community college is better, in my opinion, than 90% of public high schools. So, at least they have options. They have advanced courses. They have some people who are more involved in doing than teaching. Those are the people you want to be around. And, they have communities of students or clubs or stuff. So uh, that again, but who are the kids today? They're coming out of what's probably a very computer oriented life because, as far as I'm aware, that's really the only escape um, for most kids into computer games and on the internet, right? Like YouTube videos. I mean, I guess they're better than, reruns of Gilligan's Island, frankly. Um, and you have a certain responsibility to find things that are valuable or to indulge yourself in things that are worthless. And again, that's what I think you've got to do. You've got to take responsibility for yourself and realize that's serious. This is the time you're either going to get ahead, fall behind, or stay in the middle. And nobody else is really going to do it except you.
How can children, or let's say young adults, find things of value to them?
Well, first you have to have some crazy interest. It doesn't have to be, normal. It doesn't have to be uh, advertised or um, presented to you. I'm trying to think. Um, my older kid was interested in cooking, and so were his friends. So they did a lot of cooking. And then one of them actually went to cooking school, or two of them did, I'm not sure. And so that became something they were interested in. Even to this day, he's 28. He still is interested in cooking and makes a, you know, not a profession, but a serious hobby out of it. So cooking was available. Um, I started climbing, which at a 13-year-old means climbing cliffs because they're easier than mountains to find. And so I learned to sew. I would sew coats and I would sew sleeping bags. And that was kind of fun because it's really not that easy. And you do screw up a lot when sewing. So you got to tear it up, you know, do it over again, um, read the instructions, learn to use different machines and different materials. So, look around and see what's interesting. And if possible, find somebody who can teach you or help you, guide you. Um, it's not that easy. I've looked for lots of people. When I was interested in physics, I would look for physicists. And I got, the kiss off from a lot of people who thought I was, you know, deviating from the normal path and too uppity and, too young to ask serious questions. You know, I'm probably lucky that I didn't find more of those people, but I used some discretion and some luck and, went to universities and God, I met some really offensive people, but I kept looking until I found supportive people. And, one supportive person is really great. I remember somebody I found was a puppeteer. I don't really remember this very clearly, but he made me think you could do that. You could build puppets. And, there, if you look around your neighborhood, you may be lucky to find people who are actually maybe secretly doing something. Maybe they're, history buffs or, I don't know, even car buffs. There are tons of car buffs. There's a lot of stuff you can learn, and it's a lot more interesting than doing nothing. And personally, I think it's more interesting than computer games, but that's a matter of taste. Um, so that's what I was. And then this book I wrote, The Learning Project, they're wonderful people. One of the guys I interviewed was a street kid who became a, um, what do you call it when you paint signs on buildings? Graffiti artist. And, he came up through the ranks of graffiti artists in the city, which was a tough place to come up through. And there was, violence and theft and murder. And, he said, you got to find a mentor. And you could appreciate that in a tough city, um, a mentor can make all the difference. It's either that or a gang. And, you know, I'm not sure what a gang offers you. So, he found mentors and he's a professional graffiti artist. He lives in LA now. Um, so, anything that you're passionate about. Uh, I'm interested in John Green has this, the quick, what's it called? You know that show on YouTube? Crash Course, it's called. These 10-minute videos on tons of different subjects. And those were cute. Watch them. I mean, if it doesn't appeal for you, I guess not. But I like that kind of stuff. Uh, and you got to find it. If if the people you're hanging around with are not interesting to you, find other people. You know, and maybe older people with different people. It's a university people at a church people. But you gotta state your need. Like I'm bored, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. Uh, State it and find people who can understand you, because a lot of kids are frustrated, bored, and angry. I mean, I think it's kind of average. So there are people who understand that. And they'll offer you stuff that you may not be interested in, but it's networking. And that's another thing school doesn't teach you, networking. I mean, friends groups sort of network, but they're kind of cliquish. And you really want to be more open to outside people. So, that's travel would be great if you could do it. Even if you're in a city, travel to parts of the city you don't know. And if it's frightening and dangerous, that's a good indication that you're going to something new. Um, you got to take risks, sure.
There's a few things that you mentioned. There's two that I want to highlight where it's find those with like interest, find that passion. And the second one is travel. So when it comes to the first one for the passion, that's what I had to do. And through my own self-awareness and self-identity and through the teachers and the mentors that you mentioned, the community specifically, I found that I really enjoyed reading, obtaining information, and creating my own realities in my mind. I could live there, I can play there, then I would invite people and I would share all this wisdom because I had such a drive. It fueled me. I would read books, I would read things online. But then that was in high school. As I got older now, I started to make a little bit more money and more resources. Travel became a love. And I know that you mentioned that, and I share this with a lot of people. When you go outside of your city, or even within it, or outside of your state or province, or outside of your country, or even traveling within it, you begin to obtain the wisdom of all those different people you come in contact with. And I think young people or the generation after me, I think they're missing that because they're so wrapped up in their own world and they're so wrapped up into the online experience is that they're capable of showing the world who they would want to be through the online avatar, but they're not actually able to become that person because they're holding themselves back, because they only want to present to the faceless online community who they want to be, such as, let's say, Lincoln, they want to be the traveler, they want to be someone that builds something. They will be that online, but they won't be it in person. And sometimes I look at the obstacles that they're facing, and I think a big one is maybe they don't have the courage to
Yes,
try to be something more. What are your
yes.
thoughts on that?
Well, they don't teach you courage. In fact, they kind of teach you to be obedient in school. That's what socializing is to do what you're told. So, here are some things. If you're going to travel, you need a suitcase, you need a sleeping bag, maybe. You can get those things cheaply at used goods stores, or you can make them like I did, make sleeping bags. You can even make your own clothes, although it looks kind of funny, but what the hell. And then there are different ways to travel. When I was young, I hitchhiked, and I didn't go that far, only a few hours away. That's how I went rock climbing. I hitchhiked, and I'm glad I'm not doing that now. A lot of downtime, a lot of sitting there waiting. I think you get a lot of sort of perverts, and you get a lot of weird people. Not a lot, but you get some. Um, and I don't mean perverts in the colloquial sense. I mean perverts in the real sense. Really people you don't want to hang out with at all. You'd rather not have ever met. And that it builds your character. I can tell you close calls, but and then your parents might not really want you to be doing that stuff. So that depends. But a thing that I did, which anybody could do, I went to Costa Rica. It's a fairly cheap flight to Costa Rica. And then you say, well, I'm going to have hotels and whatever. Well, what I did was I called the hotel, the fancy hotel, and I said, can I talk to a taxi driver? And they gave me the number of a taxi driver. So I called the taxi driver and I said, Do you have a family who would like to put me up? Do you know people who would like to put me up? And he said, oh, yeah, my parents. They'll give you a place to stay. So I had a taxi driver and I had a place to stay. It didn't cost me anything, but I gave him some money anyway. And, these were just average Latino people. And what was really special, though, was that they knew the country because it's where they'd always lived. And they had relatives all over the country. So they took me into the jungle to meet their cousins who worked on the Chiquita banana plantation. And then they took me to the highlands to meet their gay uncle who lived in the woods making alcohol out of honeybees and selling it. I mean, you can't meet these people, and that's how I got like free vacations. But they're better than vacations because I'm not sitting around the pool doing nothing. I'm like meeting people and they want to know about me and I want to know about them and they live what I think are fascinating lives. Like, I mean, I guess I spoke Spanish, but I can't remember speaking it very well. And, you know, Spanish is an easy language. Um, so if you're in Toronto and you probably know French, there's a lot of countries that speak French. I mean, not as many as that speak Spanish, but you can find them, and that'd be great. Free vacations, except the cost of the getting there, which again, if you're gonna hitchhike, you could probably get there cheaply, but you probably don't have the time. Maybe you take a plane to France or something, or somewhere in Africa. I don't know who speaks French in Africa. Or you could even go wild and go to India, where no matter what language you speak, it's not going to be the one they speak. And courage. You mentioned courage. I think, like I say, they don't teach you courage. And that's a big obstacle because it takes courage to do this stuff. Even to just knock on somebody's door and say, I'm interested in what you're doing. Can you give me some direction? That takes courage. And like I say, 9 times out of 10, they'll give you the finger or tell you to stop bothering them. But one time out of 10, I met this guy who was a colleague of Albert Einstein's, and he was the most encouraging of anyone I ever met. And he was so happy to talk to me, and he talked to me for 2 days, and then I ran into him subsequently, and it turns out he's like one of the most famous guys alive. I was lucky. It had to do with his generation. They aren't so nice. He was like an old man, right? So he could he could give me time. And there are people like that out there. Um, so courage. Did you ask me a question or something like that?
Yeah, and I'll follow up with this, because we both could agree that children are taught courage, and maybe they'll go their entire life not having it, even as they grow up into adults, and they won't be as courageous as they need to be to become the man or woman that maybe they've always dreamt of. And it was always a dream of them to achieve this, but they continue to fall short because they don't have the courage. Do you see do you see adults continuing to live in the fear of becoming someone better because they won't even try it?
I wouldn't put it that way. I think uh, it doesn't strike me as that, although that's kind of the outcome. There are a lot of people who, well, look, so I'm a counselor. People come to me and they're willing to pay me money, so they tend to be the more motivated people. Um, some people come to me and they don't have to pay money because they're on insurance, and they tend to be not so motivated because they think, oh, it doesn't cost me anything. And it really, your success in counseling or learning, it depends on you. What are you going to do? And um, so I don't have a very fair view of the world because I get the motivated people or the ones who are in distress. I get some people who are crazy. They're interesting folks. Um, so, but in general, yeah, if you look at adults, what do you call average? They have a mortgage, they have a job, they have a house, they have a car, they have a family. They're kind of stuck. They're obliged financially and otherwise. And they don't have a lot of attitude to make mistakes, the kind of mistakes you need to make if you're going to be creative. So, like one of the things I tell my clients to do is do something you can fail at. So, take up painting. It's funny, I have a client who's really high performing and he took up painting and he felt so liberated that he could make these shitty paintings. And then his wife said, "Oh, that painting looks very good." And now he was all screwed up again. Now he had to make good paintings. So, don't don't get back in the rut of having to meet other people's standards. You want to be able to be creative and do it your way. So I don't know, it sounded like you might have started writing. You said you were reading, but you could have been writing. I know people who've gone from reading to writing. And you know, writing's very private. A lot of people don't want to show their writings because it takes a lot of work to refine the stuff. And but it's great. One of the kids I talked to said she had read all these science fiction books, and then she got so upset when they ended that she realized she had to start her own fantasy, and that's how she started writing. And I actually don't know where she's gotten to now since I interviewed her when she was 18, but it doesn't really matter. It takes a certain courage to be self motivated and what's the word? Passionate, possessed. Um, that also isn't taught. Passion. There's not. So what does school teach you? Well, it has sports and it has drama, and I guess you could learn passion and courage in those things, but they're kind of tepid. I mean, when I was learning rock climbing, I nearly killed myself. That and you know, really, I didn't have a teacher. I just like headed up the cliff, not knowing jack shit, and that worked for the first 30 feet. But after I was 80 feet, I realized, I was in trouble. So this kind of courage, I don't want to call it courage or foolishness, but being responsible in a really vital way, I think gets you kickstarted because there's no going back. I think once you've tasted that, everything else seems just like pablum.